So to kick things off, we are in our Active Directory server right now. The first step in our demonstration will be to create 2 new admins. So our first admin here is going to be James Whitehat. Now in this case, this is an example of a user that, as an admin, we've actually provisioned and we want to have on our server. So this is an allowed user. Now that stands in stark contrast to our second user who we're adding here. So I guess I'll go ahead and put on my hacker hat and add a user who is James Blackhat. Now James Blackhat has not been provisioned by an admin, and he is a intruder into our system. He's created an admin account and he's going to give himself admin permissions. So now that we've created both of our admin accounts, we need to go ahead and give them admin permissions. So I'll start with James Whitehat. We'll go ahead and make him a member of domain admins. And we're also going to go into attribute editor here and make sure that he has admin count set to 1. Now, this is typically done automatically by Active Directory on an hourly basis through a job. But for demonstration's sake, we don't want to have to wait an hour. So we're just going to do that manually for us. All right, now I'm making Mr. Blackhat also a domain admin. And we're good to go. We've now added our 2 admins, of course, our hacker admin account and our regular user, which is James Whitehat. So now let's go over to our workflow, and I will show you what it looks like in just a moment here. But first, before we start the workflow, we need to make sure that we're logged in as our James Blackhat user. So I'll put my hacker hat back on. I am James Blackhat. I'm going to log in to a server with those newly created credentials that I just created over on Active Directory. I'm going to hit connect. In just a moment, you'll see I'm able to connect with those newly created credentials. All right, so I am logged in as Mr. Blackhat. Now our next step here is to run our workflow. So you can see here on the top right-hand side, we have the option to manually run our workflow. Now, in an actual customer's case, this would be a workflow that's run on a scheduled basis. So perhaps every 24 hours, every hour, it's up to your organization. But again, for the demonstration's sake, we'll be running this manually. Okay, so we're now checking for any new admins that have been added to that monitored Active Directory server. In just a moment, once we've noticed any new admins have appeared, we'll send a Slack message over to our admin, and I'll put my admin hat back on and pretend I'm an admin. And you can see I did receive a new message on Slack, so I'm going to open that up. And cool, it looks like it's noticed there's 2 new admins who are added to Active Directory. Our 2 admins that we just created just a moment ago, Mr. James Whitehat right here and James Blackhat right here. We can see when they were created, about a couple minutes ago, and we can also see the associated SAM name with each user. So we also have a ServiceNow ticket, which we'll get into later. But for now, let's go ahead and investigate these newly created admins. As a sysadmin, I'm looking at these and I do recognize James Whitehat. So I'm not going to log him out. He also has no logins in the first place. And we're also not going to disable him because we do recognize him as a user that we've added. Now in our next case for James Blackhat, we're going to see if he has any logins. And he does have a login, which is good news. So we've detected that. And it's giving us the option to log out this user. So before I do that, I want to show you the actual hacker's view on the left-hand side. And I'll move Slack over here to the left-hand side. And we can say, yes, we'd like to log out the user. And we'll actually see our user get logged out unceremoniously on the right-hand side here. So I'm going to select yes. And this is Mr. James Blackhat's screen over here on the right, of course. We're now collecting the list of his processes. And just like that, he has been logged out. So great, that's step number one, right? So you might be thinking, okay, we did log him out. He's unable to access the system, but he could, of course, just log in. So in order to combat that, we also give the opportunity to disable this user that we just found. So over here on the left-hand side, you can see we're offered the choice to disable James Black Hat. We're going to say yes, and that's going to disable his Active Directory account, meaning if he tries to log in with those same credentials, which we'll do right now, I'll show you how you won't be able to. So you can see here, I know the text is a bit small, but you can see the account has been disabled. He's unable to log in with that account any longer. Great, so all actions have been completed. We foiled the hacker's attempt for now, and we created a ServiceNow ticket detailing all the steps that we took in our workflow. So let's go ahead and open up that ServiceNow ticket to take a look at the records that we kept. So a couple of fields have been already filled in here, like impact and urgency. You can see that category was set security. Of course, we can set this to whatever we want in the workflow. It's completely customizable. You can also see a couple of fields like short description and description were filled in. So this might look familiar. This is exactly the same message that we got in our Slack conversation. It's been populated into our ServiceNow ticket now. And if we go down to activities, we can see sort of a play-by-play of what we did in the entire workflow. So our first step here was, of course, when this ticket was created. We then show that we looked at James Whitehat and noticed he had no new logins. We permitted James Whitehat to be created. And then we went through and looked at James Black Hat. Remember, we talked about grabbing processes for James Black Hat before we logged him out. Those are all listed here, along with the host name of where he was logged into, of course, before we logged him out. Then we can see here in our next step that we detected and logged out our user, that we disabled him, and once everything was complete, we resolved out our ServiceNow ticket. So that's it from the sort of third-party integration side of the Yahoo workflow. I want to dive into what the actual workflow designer looks like to give you a taste of how I designed this workflow in the first place. So let's switch over to our Yahoo tab, and I'll show you what this looks like. So you can see this is our workflow designer, and we have what looks like a flow chart on this right-hand side here. This is how we actually build our workflow. So this is basically built out of these pre-built activities here. And this is what you'll see here on the left-hand side, our activities toolbox. Really easy to build out these workflows. So this is what I use for my workflow. Essentially, when you're trying to create one, you're able to utilize any of these pre-built activities. So we have Active Directory, PagerDuty, Twilio, VMware, tons of pre-built integrations. Just drag and drop into your workflow and you're good to go. So very easy to get up and running from an automation perspective. You'll see here, for example, I had an AD LDAP query activity, and all I had to do was click on Active Directory, found the activity that I wanted. This is that AD LDAP query. I dragged and dropped it into any part of my workflow. Then I hit this little customize button here to set some settings. Not a whole lot to configure here, only 2 fields that are required, but really easy to configure these. Only a few text fields you have to enter, then you're good to go. And we like to say here, once you've configured one activity, you've configured them all. And I'd say for the most part, that's pretty true. All right, so now getting into the actual workflow itself, I'm gonna go over from a bird's eye view of what's going on. You can see here, our first step here is to find admins, and that's what our AD LDAP query here does. So we have our query that's listed here, and we're grabbing any new admins that have been created. In our case, there were 2 new admins that were created. And you can actually see here in our next activity, our get rows count activity, you'll see that we're referencing our find admins variable. And what that's actually doing is, and it's what's really neat about a Yahoo NG is you're able to reference variables of activities, right? So in this case, our LDAP query returned 2 because there were 2 new admins. And then we were able to reference that with our get rows count and said, hey, what's the result of this activity? What's the result of find admins? And that's how we got the number 2. So based on that, we evaluated that activity with an if-else branch. So this is on this control side. And we said, okay, if we have 0 new admins that were created, or less than 0, then we'll terminate the workflow. But if we have more than 0, which we have 1 or 2, in our case 2, then we continue on. So that's just a good example of the configurability and the flexibility of the platform. You can actually reference activities within activities, so it's really cool. Then continuing on, we have a little more flexibility here with our while loop. So we're again referencing our new admin count variable to say we want to loop through 2 times based on how many admins we have. And each step through the loop, we want to get information on their user, right? So we want to see what's the name of the user, when they were created, and when the SAM name is. And that actually might look familiar if you see on our message in Slack. This is the same information that we populated in our Slack message. So really neat. Got that information and sent it off to our user. Then continuing on, we have our ServiceNow create record. So this is our creation of the ServiceNow ticket. We created some information. We also dynamically referenced variables like you saw before. Some of this is static, but that's basically our ServiceNow create record. We'll be updating that ServiceNow ticket throughout the workflow. And we went ahead and we started our Slack conversation with our user. Really easy to integrate with Slack and the Yahoo NG platform. Simply start a conversation in Slack, send a message with a few parameters like the message and the user. And then we also have here a question we're asking. So you remember in the workflow, we had a question about, do you want to investigate newly added users? That's what this is too. So we have a if-else branch that's related to that. If they say yes, they want to investigate, we continue on. And then we go in and we get user login events. So that's what we're looking at here in this set of events. So this Windows event log activity specifically is something to mention. So we're actually seeing what login events happened for this specific user. You can also see that we're referencing an event code 4769. This is the event code that relates to our login. We're then using a result set filter activity, which allows us to use SQL-like statements to filter through any of those login events. You can see that here. And once we have a list of login events, we know that a user has logged in. We then go through this branch and we're trying to match where they're logged into. So you remember in our workflow, we also listed a host name and information, an FQDN, and that's where we were noticing the user was logged in, and that's how we were able to log them out later on. So that's what this set of activities doing is it's extracting information from our Windows event log, and it's getting information about the IP address of where that user is logged in. You also see here we have some PowerShell scripts. And of course, we have the flexibility and the ease of use of those pre-built activities, but I want to mention this too with the Yahoo platform. If you'd like and you want to get really granular, you can use PowerShell scripts. So this might look a little bit complex, but full disclosure here, I went on Google and I searched for FQDN scripts, something along those lines. I tweaked it, took me about 5 or 10 minutes, but after that, I was good to go. So you can have your pre-built activities that are really easy to use, but if there's anything that's not out of the box, it's really easy to use the power of PowerShell to create any kind of script that you need to accomplish any goal. So I just wanted to make note of that. It is a very powerful tool, and that's how I actually found out where our user was logged into the host. So continuing on, we're seeing that they are logged in. We go down this branch here and find a message to send to the user that says, hey, now that we've found this user, do you want to log them out? So in our case, this is James Blackhat, and based on the user's response in the Slack bot, we'll go down a different branch again. So we go through here, and again, we're using a PowerShell script. Thanks, Google, for helping me find this. We went through and we listed all the processes. You'll remember that's actually what we saw in our ServiceNow ticket. We had a list of processes, and this is how we accomplished that through this PowerShell script. We then go through and update our ServiceNow ticket with that process list that's here. You can see we're referencing that ServiceNow ticket that we created earlier in the workflow and then updating it with the process list. We then go through and based on that, we log off the user. This is actually a pre-built activity, so really nice and easy here. We selected forced and we got our host name from our PowerShell script, so we knew where to log out our user. And then finally, based on that, we have our last if-else branch, which says if we were able to successfully log out our user, then we will send a message to an admin and say we were successfully able to log them out, resolve the ServiceNow ticket. But if you weren't able to, and this is an important piece of Yahoo NG, you have the flexibility to sort of error check, right? So if there was a situation where you were able to detect an admin that you wanted to log out, but you were not able to for whatever reason, we have this send email activity that's set it up here, where since we weren't able to log out the user, we shoot off an email. In this case, it's to me, but in your case, it could be a set of admins who are responsible for escalations if there is a security incident. So that flexibility is completely up to you. Then we continue on, assuming that we were able to disable them, which we were, and go into our disable account set of activities here. So you can see, based on the user's decision, if they want to disable the user, they can. We then go into our pre-built AD disable account activity, where we're referencing the SAM name of the user, which we gathered a little earlier. We're then letting our admin know that we were successfully able to delete them, disable. And then we updated that in our ServiceNow ticket, and we exited our Slack conversation. And finally, our notification email goes to an admin, which has a sort of message body of everything that was completed. They can also reference the ServiceNow ticket that they'd like, but I also wanted to have another way to notify admins. Maybe it wasn't a Slack admin. If they wanted to know what happened with the security incident, you can fill that in here. And of course, the final step in the activity is to solve out our ServiceNow record and stop our Slack conversation.